The city that never sleeps was a mantra Sarah Jenkins had internalized long ago. At 32, her life was a carefully orchestrated symphony of ambition and relentless effort. Her one-bedroom apartment in Chelsea, a modest sanctuary with exposed brick walls and a small, cherished balcony overlooking West 21st Street, was a testament to the quiet sacrifices made for a burgeoning career. It was 2004, and the air of New York City buzzed with a postmanous 9/11 resilience, a renewed focus on building, on pushing forward. For Sarah, the rhythm began at 5 a.m., a precisely measured pour of French roast coffee, the faint clatter of a bagel shop across the street announcing its opening, and the first insistent hum of subway trains rumbling beneath her. Each morning, she meticulously dressed, her wardrobe a uniform of power. Sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suits, crisp white blouses, and a collection of sensible yet stylish heels that could navigate the unforgiving granite floors of Manhattan's financial towers. Her briefcase, a battered but reliable leather attaché, wasn't merely an accessory. It was an extension of her being, a mobile command center housing market reports, complex models, and the omnipresent BlackBerry she relied upon for constant connectivity, even in the firm's deepest conference rooms. She was a vice president in mergers and acquisitions at Sterling and Pike, a storied investment bank whose name was etched in the very bedrock of Wall Street history. The firm's Madison Avenue headquarters, a gleaming tower of polished chrome and tinted glass, felt less like an office and more like a high-stakes arena where fortunes were made and lost with equal, dizzying speed. Sarah had navigated these treacherous waters with an understated brilliance, her analytical mind a finely honed instrument capable of dissecting the most convoluted financial structures, spotting discrepancies, and forecasting market shifts that eluded others. Her ascent through the ranks hadn't been marked by flashy presentations or charismatic speeches, but by an unwavering dedication, an almost monastic focus on the minutiae that truly drove deals. She was the one who consistently delivered the impeccably researched reports, the bulletproof valuation models, the deep-dive analyses that formed the bedrock of Sterling and Pike's most significant transactions. Her colleagues, mostly men a decade or two her senior, often dismissed her quiet diligence as mere grunt work. But Sarah knew it was the indispensable scaffolding upon which empires were built. She consistently worked 18-hour days, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the occasional forgotten takeout container, the distant, shimmering promise of a corner office and true recognition her guiding star. This quiet competence, however, was a double-edged sword, making her susceptible to the more audacious, self-aggrandizing personalities that often occupied the executive suite. Her current project was a gargantuan undertaking, the acquisition of Terra Corp, a beleaguered but strategically critical independent oil and gas exploration firm based in Houston, Texas. The buyer was Nexus Holdings, a rapidly expanding energy conglomerate looking to solidify its domestic market share in the volatile energy sector. The deal, hovering just shy of $3 billion, was a labyrinth of environmental liabilities stemming from Terra Corp's older drilling sites in the Gulf Coast, intricate regulatory compliance challenges in 3 different states, and a complex tapestry of legacy debt and pension obligations. It was the kind of deal that could make or break careers, the jewel in the crown of any CFO's resume. For Sterling and Pike, it represented significant fees and a powerful statement of their market dominance. On paper, the deal's ostensible leader was Art Sterling, the firm's 58-year-old CFO. Art, a man whose silver hair, booming, confident laugh, and perfectly tailored suits projected an image of unshakable authority, was a master of corporate theatrics. Beneath the veneer of seasoned wisdom lay a ruthless, opportunistic ambition, a willingness to leverage others' talents for his own gain. While Art charmed clients at elaborate dinners in exclusive Manhattan establishments, Sarah was the one deep in the trenches, pulling all-nighters. She had personally spearheaded the creation of the multi-layered valuation models, conducted the exhaustive due diligence across hundreds of thousands of documents in virtual data rooms, and meticulously crafted the intricate financing structures that would make the acquisition feasible. She'd spent weeks immersed in obscure environmental regulatory frameworks, negotiating with formidable legal teams from New York's top firms like Skadden Arps and Davis Polk, and painstakingly building genuine rapport with TerraCorp's executive vice president of finance, Eleanor Vance, a quiet but sharp woman, and more importantly, with Nexus Holdings' discerning CEO, David Chen. Her direct, trust-based line of communication with Chen, a shrewd operator known for his incisive questions and demand for transparent data, had been instrumental in painstakingly keeping the delicate, often contentious negotiations on track. This connection, she would soon realize, was her most potent, unquantifiable asset. The moment of public humiliation, stark and unforgettable, descended on a brisk Tuesday morning in mid-October. The air was pregnant with anticipation. This was the penultimate board meeting, the one where the final, meticulously negotiated terms of the TerraCorp acquisition were to be presented, dissected, and ultimately approved. The setting was the firm's most opulent executive conference room, a hallowed space on the 48th floor. Floor-to-ceiling, windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic sweep of the Hudson River, the Statue of Liberty a distant, stoic sentinel, while the interior exuded an almost oppressive sense of hushed power. Polished mahogany gleamed under recessed lighting, thick Persian rugs swallowed the sound of footsteps, and the very air seemed to hum with the quiet reverence afforded to monumental financial transactions. Sarah, impeccably dressed but with a barely perceptible tremor in her hands, sat strategically at the periphery of the long, rectangular table. Her role, she knew, was to be a discreet but essential presence, ready to provide any granular detail requested. Her meticulous presentation decks, a binder thick with supporting legal documentation, and a laptop hummed with data, all lay ready before her. Art Sterling, the firm's CFO, strode to the head of the table, commanding the room with his sheer physical presence and an air of practiced authority. Resplendent in a charcoal gray bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, he began his presentation. It was a masterful, theatrical performance of executive bravado. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the room, painting a vivid picture of triumph. He spoke with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed every word he uttered. "Gentlemen and ladies," he began, his gaze sweeping the room, "today we stand on the precipice of a landmark achievement for Sterling and Pike. The acquisition of TerraCorp by Nexus Holdings, a deal of immense strategic importance, is the culmination of months of arduous, yet incredibly rewarding, work." He then launched into the details, meticulously outlining the intricate financial architecture he had personally overseen, the ingenious strategies he had devised to navigate the regulatory minefield, and the tireless, often late-night negotiations he had conducted with both the buyer and the seller. Each booming pronouncement, each confident assertion of sole authorship, felt like a white-hot dagger twisting deeper into Sarah's gut. He used her slides, her perfectly formatted data visualizations, her very words lifted verbatim from her internal memos, without a single glance in her direction. No acknowledgement, no credit, not even a subtle nod. He was a conductor, taking extravagant bows for an entire symphony composed note by painstaking note by another, while its true author stood in the shadows, rendered invisible. The crushing weight of his appropriation reached its unbearable climax when a board member, old Mr. Harrison, a veteran of countless hostile takeovers and a notorious stickler for excruciating detail, interjected. "Art," he rumbled, adjusting his spectacles, "could you elaborate on the earn-out clause regarding the asset divestitures? I recall it being particularly nuanced, almost bespoke." This was Sarah's triumph, a mechanism she had spent weeks perfecting, weaving in safeguards against future market volatility. Art paused, a flicker of uncertainty, a micro-expression of panic, ghosted across his usually impassive face. For a terrifying, fleeting second, Sarah thought, hoped he might finally defer to her, acknowledge her expertise, even if just for a single, begrudging sentence. But then, the mask of corporate composure snapped back into place. He straightened his tie with a deliberate gesture, forced a knowing, dismissive smile, and spun a confident, if completely vague and oversimplified, explanation. He glossed over the intricate safeguards she had painstakingly built in, reducing her months of complex financial engineering to a few platitudes. He had twisted her work, diluted its genius, taking full credit while subtly diminishing the very complexities that made the deal robust and future-proof. The room, filled with powerful men and a few women who had navigated similar treacherous waters, nodded approvingly at Art's seamless, confident display. Sarah felt a cold, paralyzing knot tighten in her stomach, a physical manifestation of the betrayal. Her face remained a mask of impassive professionalism, but inside, a silent, raging volcano of humiliation and fury erupted, threatening to consume her. She felt not just overlooked, but fundamentally erased. The weeks of sleepless nights, the intellectual rigor, the emotional investment, the sheer exhaustive effort, all of it had been effortlessly appropriated, repackaged, and presented as another man's singular genius. The quiet, almost sympathetic whispers among the junior analysts, the fleeting, knowing glances from a few sympathetic VPs who recognized her contribution, were small, hollow comforts. This wasn't merely about credit. It was a profound assault on her professional integrity, a blatant theft of her intellectual property, and a cruel invalidation of her worth. It was a message, loud and clear, that in this cutthroat world, hard work alone was never enough. That evening, the carefully constructed edifice of her professional composure didn't just crack, it imploded. Sarah returned to her Chelsea apartment, the familiar city lights, usually a comforting embrace, now blurred into distorted streaks through a film of unshed tears. The heavy oak door thudded shut behind her, amplifying the oppressive silence. She didn't bother to turn on the lights, letting the fading twilight paint her living room in shades of bruised purple and gray. Her battered leather briefcase, a symbol of her relentless pursuit, was flung onto the floor with a force that surprised even her, the sharp report echoing hollowly against the hardwood. The silence, thick and suffocating, felt hostile, amplifying the insidious echo of Art Sterling's booming, self-congratulatory voice in her head. She paced the length of her small living room, a restless predator trapped in a cage, her frustration morphing into a raw, visceral ache that spread through her chest and throat. She felt cheap used, like a high-precision machine whose intricate output had been stolen and rebranded. The initial wave of despair was overwhelming. Quitting, disappearing, moving to some remote corner of the world where spreadsheets and power plays ceased to exist, became an intoxicating, albeit fleeting, fantasy. But beneath the tidal wave of despondency, a bedrock of years of grit and unwavering determination began to assert itself. This wasn't just a slight, a minor setback. It was an existential threat to her career. A stark, undeniable message that her hard work could be effortlessly cannibalized by those higher up the food chain, leaving her hollowed out and invisible. The initial, paralyzing despair slowly, almost imperceptibly, gave way to a chilling, diamond-hard clarity. This wasn't an incident to be passively endured or quietly forgotten. It was a battle for her professional soul, a personal war that, despite the staggering odds, she was determined to win. But how? She was a vice president, a diligent foot soldier, pitted against a chief financial officer, a seasoned general armed with institutional power and an unassailable reputation. The power imbalance was staggering, almost insurmountable. She uncorked a bottle of cheap Merlot, the kind she usually reserved for particularly grueling weeknights, letting the bitter, astringent taste sting her tongue. The laptop, a sleek, silver IBM ThinkPad, sat accusatorily on her kitchen island, its screen a dark, reflective mirror. With a sigh, she powered it on. The familiar corporate logo flickered to life, followed by the glowing cells of a complex financial model she had built from scratch. It was her creation, her intellectual property. She had meticulously documented every single communication, every nuanced revision to the deal terms, every whispered meeting note pertaining to the TerraCorp acquisition. It was her digital fortress, a meticulous audit trail, a testament to her thoroughness. She spent hours that night, huddled in the glow of the screen, rereading her labyrinthine email exchanges, her detailed internal memos, her exhaustive notes from countless conference calls with David Chen, the Nexus Holdings CEO, and with TerraCorp's executive VP of Finance, Eleanor Vance, a quiet, principled woman whose respect Sarah had painstakingly earned. A small detail, almost an afterthought in the maelstrom of the day's raw humiliation, began to crystallize, glinting like a forgotten shard of glass in the recesses of her memory. Weeks ago, during a late-night call about bond covenants, Eleanor had offhandedly mentioned a potential shift in the regulatory landscape concerning specific, older environmental bonds that TerraCorp held, a legacy issue from the 1980s involving abandoned drilling sites. Sarah had immediately flagged this internally, sending a cautionary memo to Art and the legal team, highlighting the potential for increased liability. Art, in his infinite arrogance, had simply dismissed it as minor noise, a fringe concern, confident that his deep-seated political connections in Washington, D.C. would effortlessly smooth over any perceived regulatory ripples. Sarah, however, knew better. She had continued to track it, quietly, diligently, subscribing to obscure environmental law journals and setting up digital alerts for EPA announcements. This seemingly minor noise, she now realized with a jolt that sent a tremor through her, was not just a ripple. It was, in fact, a looming seismic event, a fault line running directly beneath Art's triumphant, yet ultimately fragile deal. Her advantage, a quiet, potent force, lay not in institutional power or flashy rhetoric, but in her unparalleled, granular grasp of the deal's most intricate details, and crucially, her genuine, trust-based relationships with the key external players. Art Sterling, for all his strategic overview and big-picture swagger, was ultimately a showman. He lacked the deep-dive technical understanding that only hours of meticulous data analysis could provide. And more significantly, he lacked the human connection, the rapport forged in the trenches of endless negotiations and shared frustrations. He saw people as mere pawns in his grand corporate chess game. Sarah, conversely, viewed them as partners, each with their own interests and vulnerabilities. She realized with a cold, almost exhilarating clarity that her revenge couldn't be a direct, explosive confrontation. Such an act would be career suicide, a public immolation. It had to be surgical, exquisitely quiet, and devastatingly effective. She wouldn't just expose him as a fraud. She would dismantle his meticulously constructed victory, piece by painstaking piece, making it appear to be an unavoidable consequence of his own arrogance, his own fatal negligence. Her plan, a complex, multi-layered chess game to be played in the hushed, labyrinthine corridors of corporate finance, began to solidify. The environmental bonds, those were the fulcrum. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the new EPA guidelines, slated for imminent announcement within the next 3 to 4 weeks, would significantly devalue those specific, older environmental bonds TerraCorp held. These were not generic bonds. They were tied to specific, outdated waste disposal sites and had clauses that made them particularly vulnerable to updated environmental legislation. The impending reclassification of these sites would instantly throw a wrench into the finely tuned valuation models Art had so proudly presented as his own. More critically, the initial purchase agreement, which Art had prematurely and boastfully declared final to the board, contained specific clauses regarding material adverse changes, MACs, directly related to environmental liabilities. If triggered, this MAC clause would provide Nexus Holdings with a powerful legal lever, allowing them to renegotiate the terms of the acquisition, or even, in an extreme scenario, walk away from the deal entirely without incurring substantial penalty. Art, in his blind rush to claim credit and his contemptuous dismissal of minor noise, had not only overlooked the severity of this impending regulatory shift, but had also fundamentally underestimated Sarah's relentless, diligent tracking of it. His hubris had created the very weapon she now intended to wield. Her strategy was a masterclass in covert operations, meticulously multi-pronged. 1. Cultivate and leverage existing relationships with surgical precision. She needed to subtly re-engage both David Chen, the CEO of Nexus Holdings, and Alina Vance, TerraCorp's EVP of Finance. Her approach would not be to expose Art directly. That would be too risky and unprofessional. Instead, she would present new, evolving information that would safeguard their respective interests, and, by extension, the integrity of the deal itself, albeit in a subtly modified and ultimately safer form. This was about framing it as a mutual benefit, a necessary adjustment. 2. Highlight the unseen risk with disarming neutrality, without ever directly undermining Art's authority or his initial presentation. She would quietly, professionally, and methodically guide Nexus Holdings' legal and finance teams towards the impending EPA announcement and its undeniable implications for TerraCorp's environmental bond portfolio. She would strategically emphasize the potential trigger of the MAC clause, not as an accusation, but as a proactive warning and urgent risk mitigation. 3. Propose an optimized and unassailable solution. She would then present a revised deal structure, meticulously crafted to mitigate this newly highlighted risk. This would involve shifting a significant portion of the environmental liability into a separate, carefully constructed escrow account or a contingent payment mechanism, dependent on future environmental remediation outcomes and regulatory compliance. This revised structure would be framed as a proactive, forward-thinking measure designed to ensure the deal's long-term stability and success, something beneficial for everyone involved, especially for Nexus Holdings, who would now be shielded from unexpected liabilities. The elegant, devastating beauty of this approach was that this new, optimized structure would effectively render Art's original, finalized terms obsolete and inadequate, without him ever realizing he was being systematically outmaneuvered by his own, overlooked subordinate. 4. Maintain absolute discretion and leave no trace. Crucially, there could be no paper trail, no email, no witness that could possibly implicate her in deliberately undermining Art. Every communication would be carefully worded, every meeting framed as routine, necessary due diligence, or a proactive deal optimization session. Her reputation for meticulousness would serve as her perfect cover. She would operate in the shadows, an unseen hand orchestrating the inevitable collapse of Art's hollow triumph. The following weeks transformed into an intense, exhilarating blur of calculated maneuvers, each move a carefully placed piece in her intricate corporate chess game. Sarah abandoned her usual routine of morning runs, instead rising even earlier, often working from her home office. The Chelsea apartment shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, her laptop screen a lonely beacon. Sometimes, she'd stay late at the Sterling and Pike offices, waiting until the last of the cleaning crew had departed, finding an empty conference room on a deserted floor where she could work without interruption. The only sound the gentle hum of the building's HVAC system. Her first contact was with David Chen, the shrewd CEO of Nexus Holdings. She reached out under the guise of following up on some minor regulatory considerations she'd been tracking, which might impact the deal's longer-term value proposition. Her tone was always deferential, professional, never hinting at the true depth of her agenda. She then presented him with a comprehensive, impeccably researched report, a document far more detailed and forward-looking than anything Art had ever provided. It meticulously outlined the upcoming EPA changes, citing specific precedents and legal opinions, complete with her revised financial projections, showing the inevitable and significant devaluation of TerraCorp's environmental bonds. Chen, a man whose success was built on an almost prescient ability to identify and mitigate risk, listened intently, his expression growing progressively graver. He recognized the depth of her analysis, the stark contrast to Art's generalized, hand-waving pronouncements. "This is incredibly significant, Sarah," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, his gaze piercing. Art didn't mention any of this in his final presentation. Sarah merely offered a polite, professional shrug, feigning a neutral surprise. "Perhaps the information only recently became clearer, Mr. Chen. My apologies for not bringing it to your attention sooner, but the precise nature of the upcoming regulatory changes was still developing. I just felt it prudent to ensure you had the most accurate picture." It was a subtle, carefully constructed lie, one designed to deflect blame from herself while subtly planting seeds of doubt about Art's competence. Next, she engaged Alina Vance, TerraCorp's EVP of Finance. She presented the same, meticulously prepared information, framing it not as a problem, but as an opportunity for TerraCorp to proactively protect itself from potential future liabilities, and crucially, to ensure the deal's smooth and final completion. Alina, a woman who had herself grown weary of Art's condescending demeanor and his tendency to dismiss her own detailed concerns, immediately recognized the logic and the genuine foresight in Sarah's approach. "You've always been thorough, Sarah," Alina observed, a hint of admiration, almost conspiratorial understanding in her voice. "More so than some others around here." The quiet validation was a small but powerful balm to Sarah's wounded pride. The subtle wheels of her plan, now greased by growing concern from the buyer and seller, began to turn with increasing momentum. David Chen, now armed with Sarah's incontrovertible data and fully aware of the ticking regulatory clock, convened an urgent internal meeting at Nexus Holdings with his legal and finance teams. He expressed serious concerns about the previously undisclosed environmental liabilities and the potentially catastrophic impact of the imminent EPA announcement on the deal's current valuation. He then, with Sarah's subtle prompting, referenced the material adverse change, MAC clause in the purchase agreement, a clause he had previously been assured by Art Sterling's team wouldn't be an issue. With newfound resolve, Chen initiated a formal demand for renegotiation of specific financial terms. Art Sterling, meanwhile, was spectacularly oblivious. He was not just basking in the glow of his supposed triumph. He was positively luxuriating in it, already mentally drafting his hefty bonus memo and planning a celebratory vacation to the Caribbean. He saw the renegotiation, requests from Nexus Holdings, as minor posturing, typical last-minute jitters from a buyer trying to squeeze out a better deal. "Just noise," he'd scoffed to his executive assistant, waving a dismissive hand. He dispatched a bewildered junior associate, fresh out of Wharton, to handle the details of these trivial adjustments, confident that his masterful framework would hold firm, unyielding to such petty squabbles. This, Sarah knew, was his fatal, arrogant error. He delegated the very details that contained his undoing, the precise intricacies that would unravel his carefully constructed lie. Sarah, now working with the full, albeit unspoken, blessing of both David Chen and Alina Vance, seamlessly transitioned into the central pivot of the renegotiation. With Art effectively sidelined by his own complacency and arrogance, she expertly guided the entire process. She ensured that the core value of the deal remained intact for Sterling and Pike. Her loyalty to the firm was unwavering, even if her loyalty to its CFO was non-existent. However, she fundamentally, irrevocably altered the financial architecture that Art had so loudly and falsely claimed credit for. The environmental liability, once a looming, unacknowledged threat, was now meticulously shifted into a complex, multi-tiered escrow account. A contingent payment mechanism dependent entirely on future environmental remediation outcomes and the final clarity of the EPA's new guidelines. This fundamentally altered TerraCorp's valuation, the payment schedule, and the risk profile for Nexus Holdings. The deal was no longer Art Sterling's masterpiece, a work of singular genius. It was now a much more nuanced, transparent, and critically risk-mitigated agreement, a living testament to Sarah's foresight, her diligent work, and her quiet, strategic brilliance. The original deal, Art's deal, had been rendered obsolete without a single direct attack on his authority. It had simply and elegantly evolved past him. The day of the final signing arrived 2 weeks later than Art had initially projected, the delay a silent harbinger of his impending unraveling. The atmosphere in the executive suite was not one of triumphant celebration, but rather a somber, almost tense quietude. Art Sterling, resplendent in another bespoke suit, but with a subtle furrow of unease now etched between his brows, was summoned into the CEO's sprawling office. A cavernous space with dark wood paneling and a commanding view of Central Park. Inside, Thomas Vance, Sterling and Pike's CEO, a stern but fundamentally fair man who had built the firm from the ground up, sat behind his imposing desk. Beside him sat the firm's general counsel, a hawk-eyed woman named Evelyn Reed, whose legal mind was as sharp as a scalpel. On the gleaming mahogany table before them lay the thick stack of revised terms, now bearing the official signatures of both Nexus Holdings and Terra Corp, awaiting Sterling and Pike's final, crucial approval. Art's usual bombast faltered. His face, usually florid with an almost performative self-importance, drained of color as he began to skim the documents, his eyes darting frantically across the pages. The new clauses, the intricate escrow agreements, the fundamentally revised valuation. It was all there, a stark repudiation of his final deal. He stammered, a guttural sound of disbelief. What in God's name is this? This isn't the deal we agreed upon. This isn't my deal. Thomas Vance, his gaze steady and unwavering, looked at Art with a penetrating intensity that brooked no argument. Art, he said, his voice calm, measured, but imbued with an undeniable authority. This is the deal. Nexus Holdings, with entirely justifiable concerns, identified significant, unaddressed environmental risks that you, apparently, overlooked. Sarah Jenkins, on her own initiative, demonstrated incredible foresight. She worked tirelessly and discreetly with both sides, with David Chen and a leaner Vance, to proactively re-engineer the financial structure, mitigating these risks. Without her decisive, intelligent intervention, Nexus Holdings was prepared to walk away entirely. She saved this deal, Art. The question I have for you is, what happened to your oversight, to your due diligence, to your leadership on what you presented as your flagship transaction? Art Sterling stood there, utterly and completely deflated. The grand narrative of his triumph had not just evaporated. It had been meticulously vaporized, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of public failure and implicit, undeniable incompetence. He was forced to explain the loss, not a loss of the acquisition itself, for the company still secured its fees and reputation, but a devastating loss of his deal, his structure, his undisputed, self-proclaimed claim to victory. He had to account for why the deal had been renegotiated, so drastically, so quietly, under his supposed leadership. He had to explain why a junior vice president, a woman he had systematically erased from the project's narrative, had been the one to identify and fix the critical, multi-billion-dollar flaws he had so arrogantly dismissed. He stammered through a pathetic, convoluted explanation about unforeseen market dynamics and unpredictable regulatory shifts. His voice losing its usual timbre, but the damage was irreversible. Every person in that mahogany-paneled room, from the CEO to the hawk-eyed general counsel, understood the stark, uncomfortable truth. Art Sterling had been thoroughly outmaneuvered, exposed as superficial, complacent, and ultimately negligent. He had taken credit for another's tireless work, and in doing so, had blinded himself to the very details that could have saved him from this very public, very humiliating reckoning. Sarah watched from the adjacent glass-walled office, ostensibly reviewing a stack of year-end balance sheets. Her heart beat a slow, steady, triumphant rhythm. There was no outward celebration, no smug smile of victory on her lips. Just a quiet, profound satisfaction, a deep-seated calm that settled over her like a comforting blanket. Her revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was an act of surgical precision, a silent, almost invisible correction of an egregious wrong. She hadn't taken explicit credit for the New Deal, either. She hadn't needed to. Her work spoke for itself, echoing through the hushed corridors of executive power without her having to utter a single boastful word. Thomas Vance, the CEO, later stopped by her desk, a rare, almost unprecedented occurrence for a vice president. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, measured, carrying the weight of his office, "I just wanted to say, your work on the TerraCorp acquisition, particularly the past few weeks, was exceptional. Truly exceptional." He nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that spoke volumes in a firm where every nuance was dissected. "We value that kind of dedication, that kind of foresight. Keep up the excellent work." A quiet, knowing smile flickered across his face. Her professional reputation was not merely solidified, it was elevated, forged in the crucible of silent competence and undeniable, tangible results. Art Sterling's star, once a supernova in the firm's firmament, began its slow, inexorable dimming. He remained CFO, his position too deeply entrenched for immediate, outright dismissal, but his influence waned, his authority subtly undercut. He was now known, not just internally but in whispered circles across Wall Street, as the executive who had almost spectacularly lost a $3 billion deal he'd loudly claimed as his own, only for a junior vice president to quietly, brilliantly, and indispensably save it. The whispers, this time, were different. They were about Sarah's formidable intellect, her quiet strength, her strategic genius. And as for Sarah, she understood, with a clarity that resonated deep within her, the true, profound power of silent revenge. It wasn't about destroying another's career, but about reclaiming and rebuilding her own, one meticulously planned, quietly executed move at a time. The Taurus CFO had taken credit for her work. She had quietly moved the deal and watched him explain the loss. And in the quiet aftermath, as the city lights twinkled outside her Chelsea window, she found a profound, lasting peace, a silent victory more satisfying than any public acclamation.